Thanks so much, Rudolph. Thanks, Vijay. And thanks all the colleagues for joining. And I think what I was going to say, Rudolph already said. So I was just going to give you a little introduction on why we started doing this. And I'll just elaborate a little bit. And it all began with Rudolph's project. So it's actually nice that he's sharing it. We do miss Tatiana. But it all began with the solid waste sector loan. And we had so many questions. And since this is like a knowledge sharing, we thought we'd just keep going with those questions and just have this all like an engaged thing and not like a presentation or something, because there are still many questions. And that is the reason why we actually ventured out to write and document those questions in a form of a working paper, which we thought would sort of engage and get experiences from other colleagues and, sort of help in articulating why this GHG thing, giving it more meaning, trying to understand what GHG means for the urban sector, especially in the secondary city space, which is really small, with very low volumes of waste, not much business happening there. So, but still, cities are a huge contributor to GDPs, and cities are a huge contributor to emissions. So, what is really the first step? And why should we take that first step? So there are multiple contributors to this, and the questions just kept on increasing. So thanks to that loan, we were able to sort of raise those questions and at the same time answer some of them. And that's what we try to articulate in this. So basically, what we are trying to do here is answer the question and ask more questions on why. What were the key challenges that we faced, and we try to articulate that. There are more challenges, actually. The more we think, there are more challenges. We also felt while researching this and our own experience in documenting the solid waste project that there are a number of opportunities, and ADB are actually very well positioned to in terms of a business opportunity to catalyze, resource technical opportunity as well, and to be basically a contributor as well as a user of these opportunities that exist. And so that was a very key learning for us. And we also tried to articulate with, we were lucky with the solid waste loan because the PPTA was still ongoing. And we were so lucky that the PPTA team leader happened to be a solid waste management expert. So he was very sort of into, we were able to gain from their practical experience as well. And so the steps to estimate these emissions, was another learning in itself. Now, the solid waste sector loan looked at waste, not at the city-wide inventory. So it was just basically a very small beginning, but it opened an entire roadmap to, what inventorization would mean. We just started with the waste composition and the waste characteristics and sort of inventorizing those. But then what does it mean to scale it up to a city level? And using the same platform, using the same similar tools, and the kinds of resources we get for our projects. And then what types of urban operations should really consider this? So these are a few opportunities that we try to articulate. And then, of course, sorry, I think I will just keep this. We do have an anchor. To do anything, there is an enabling anchor. ADB's anchor is very good. We have a safeguard policy which clearly articulates the promotion and reduction of project-related GHGs, and then also looks at sort of commitment towards documenting. And there is a specific, there's a criteria that significant quantities is defined more than 100,000 tons. But nevertheless, that does not mean that only energy sector operations or only transport sector operations should really do that. And so we as a team then started sort of distilling these hooks into our loan, and we started sort of looking at elaborating what this would mean, because we knew that it's not 100,000 tons that's going to be coming out from a small little city which has under 40,000 population. But the opportunity we saw was to sort of articulate this definition to a larger national level, because the loan that we were working on was a sector loan. So that's where we were with it. ADB strategy and commitments are also very vocal, and we are, by strategy 2020, aim to look at both mitigation and adaptation measures through all our operations. In our urban sector operations, of course, there's more opportunity always for adaptation type work, and especially in Southeast Asia, where we're dealing with a lot of disaster risks and natural disaster risks and floods and a lot of hydrological issues. But in terms of urban services, there is a lot of potential also to look at improved technologies for reduction of GHG emissions. And so mitigation opportunities are always there. The midterm review strategy also sort of aims to articulate that, and we need to, that is another good hook. And ADB's commitments are, ADB is more and more now involved in the larger global climate change area, where it's either administering or catalyzing or facilitating, larger climate funds. So there is a role to play, and that ADB is playing very well. And I think as regional project teams, as project operations, in whichever limited way, it's like every drop counts. So we can be contributors, as well as sort of use those opportunities for leveraging larger funds that are available. So and to ensure that these commitments are fulfilled, mitigation progress has to be measured. And the way to do that would be, the first step would be to create an inventory and just understand the baselines that we are dealing with. And moving back from there is what we've tried to articulate in the paper. So like I said, just to give you an idea of the kinds of funds that are available that ADB can indirectly or directly access, leverage, catalyze, facilitate. A few of these listed here. In case there are more and we haven't listed them, we'll be actually really happy to know which those are. And that's really the purpose of this meeting today. And we're hoping that, through these kind of systematic approaches in various sectors, we could actually sort of contribute to ADB getting more into an harmonized and standardized framework, as with other development MDPs.
You want me to?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
So that you don't get bored with my monotone.
So
Sami is going to enthuse everybody with his diagnostic power.
So let's move to the urban sector. And I guess the key here is that sort of capturing emission estimates is something that is yet to be mainstreamed in the urban sector. In Southeast Asia, when we looked over projects in the last 3 to 4 years, we actually found no operations where we had done project level emissions or done city sort of greenhouse gas inventories. So there is sort of potential to take this work forward in the urban sector. This is important because cities are recognized as major contributors to global greenhouse gas emissions, covering less than 2% of the Earth's surface, consuming more than 75% of the world's energy, and of course contributing more than half of the carbon dioxide and significant amounts of other greenhouse gas emissions. What's interesting is that many cities already regularly measure and disclose their greenhouse gas emissions. So we found sort of several, organizations that actually do this, and the numbers are quite large. When we looked at sort of cities outside North America and Europe, it was mostly in East and South Africa, Latin America, some in India, and now China has its own sort of initiative where it's looking at about 30 odd cities. In Southeast Asia, we saw some in Indonesia and Malaysia, and a few in the Philippines, but not so much in the rest of the countries. So Southeast Asia is a bit behind the curve in terms of GHG inventories.
Yeah, I'll just pitch in a bit, and we'll just keep doing that, so bear with us. And please also don't, if you want to just engage, please do. I just want to pitch in here that we didn't see a reason why Southeast Asia should be behind the curve. Because I think there is a lot of awareness already, and we have a very solid presence in Southeast Asia beyond the urban sector as well. There are some very interesting initiatives that Samir researched yesterday on the Covenant of Mayors, for example, which is like really local governments coming together in Europe, and they're actually reporting these emissions in a very systematic way. They have a harmonized, standardized approach. Now, what we felt where the gap was is that we are engaging at a local government level. We can't engage at a local government level, sorry. We basically engage at the national level. So there is some kind of bridging that's required from our own side in terms of that engagement to facilitate this. So it's a multi-pronged approach which may be required. And directly, when we engage with our clients, we don't directly engage with a city, right? Our first interaction is with the national ministries.
So just to make the point that when we're talking about greenhouse gas accounting, we're talking basically at three levels. So the first is at the project level. So this is what Sonia had presented earlier in terms of what the safeguards policy is dealing with, which is talking about this being a requirement if it's above a significant quantity. This is common for energy and transportation projects, less so for urban projects. And of course, these serve as inputs then to a city level greenhouse gas inventory. As we saw, this is already done in many cities globally. And we really saw this as a tool that can sort of complement comprehensive urban planning. And we'll talk a bit more about this when we talk about the opportunities. And these, of course, serve as inputs to national level inventories, which are already done by many developing countries. That they also form the basis for sort of the higher level international negotiations and policy discussions, and may contribute towards measuring progress towards the sustainable development goal on climate. And for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to be focusing on the project level and on the city level, sort of what the entry points might be for ADB's projects. So we'll be talking about both of these levels. So in terms of some of the challenges, I think the complex nature of the urban sector, which we're all used to, also translates into greenhouse gas accounting. So if you look at the different sectors that are related to the urban sector, and you start looking at the kinds of emissions that you have to quantify. For example, for automobile fuel consumption, you have to look at both the composition and the standards of fuel, as well as on the traffic and efficiency of the road networks. You're bringing together information from the energy and the transportation sectors. If you look at a solid waste management project where you have organic waste that you're composting and producing natural fertilizer, and that's actually replacing processed fertilizer, you need to look at sort of the waste sector and the agriculture sector and what kind of overlaps there might be. This sort of complexity also translates into the institutional complexity, which we're all also familiar with. This is showing in the Philippines what the institutional structure is. And the Philippines is actually interesting because they've now identified which ministries are responsible for specific duties with regard to their greenhouse gas inventorization. But regardless, when you're doing a city inventory, you have to sort of contend with data and with different institutions at different places, all of whom might have their own setups in terms of how they collect and standardize data. In the urban sector, I think the other issue is just the perception that the emissions for individual activities or sub-projects are quite limited. So is it really something that's valuable? Is it cost effective to actually try and quantify them? And we have some interesting examples later on why it might be actually useful to do that. The other challenge is on the availability of data. I think this is the biggest challenge, not only having data, but having it in a format that's compatible and that you can standardize to actually do the analysis that you need. And of course, doing a city level inventory takes time and money. So we actually got some data from ICLE, who is also one of our peer reviewers and supports many cities in the world for doing this. They do smaller cities like Malacca all the way to cities like Delhi. And what they told us was that for small cities, it takes between 4 to 6 months. It can take 9 to 12 months for sort of the large and mega cities. The cost range somewhere between $40,000 to $120,000. And this again depends a lot on what data is already available in the city, what level of coordination is already there, if you need any kind of specialized software to convert data in a particular format. And of course, the cost is highest for the first instance when you compile an inventory. Once you have the process in place, it becomes much more streamlined.
It's also the institutions that are available at the city level to sort of engage and help you do that. Usually the agencies are so under-equipped even to perform their own urban service function that this is really the last thing that comes to anybody's mind, like, why should I be doing this? So ICLE again is also an expert at working at a very grassroots and local level. So they had some really interesting experiences to share, and they actually take that as a given that there's going to be no data available and there's going to be no human bodies to do this stuff. So that's the baseline. So eventually, then things start rolling, and we've started. We have some sort of good beginnings with Malacca, which is really not that small a city, but at least the motivation and the vision or the objective within their own city's corporate strategy, they want to move ahead with this. So they've partnered with ICLE now to sort of get this thing going. So yeah, I mean, I think there is an opportunity here to build that capacity, like I just mentioned, with agencies like ICLE, etc. There is really, in the larger common good, a very strong case for moving towards inventorization and systemizing these approaches, which then in the long run actually become a very simple mechanical process. If we and there are available tools, like if you use the Heat Plus tool or the carbon registry mechanism that ICLE has, and there may be many more like that. It's actually becomes a very simple organizational sort of process for a city to engage and to sort of develop these. So that there's clearly an opportunity there. There's an opportunity for ADB to sort of build that into project design, and the cost is really not that much. When we are designing multi-sector projects, I mean, and we're looking at climate change reduction as an overall impact, for example, these in some projects these would make sense with very small incremental costs. And if there are if we have access to different types of funds, then that becomes the leveraging potential also increases. Quantification is really important, and that's really what we thought was lacking. It's conceptualizing in the Philippines also. They're very good at conceptualizing everything, but distilling it to actual quantities is always difficult thing. Now, one learning through the when we started doing this work, one learning also was that there are tools available, and which tool to pick. So there are so many tools available, and everybody wants that their tool should be used, and you get maximum hit. But and ADB also has some guidelines on mitigation, but ADB's climate unit, right? They were also open to that we can use universal tools that are available, whichever suits the country's regulatory mechanism. So in terms of an opportunity, it was also gave us an opportunity to experiment a little bit with what works. And finally, for the solid waste sector loan, we used IGES instead of typically using and in complement to ADB's own guidelines on this. So what we've also found through working through this paper is that just putting a system of thought, like this city has this system for inventorization, increases its city's capacity to leverage private sector investments. The green brand, they have made some beginning. It's good, and even if the investments are small, they can be leveraged, and slowly competitiveness increases within cities. And there is, of course, that big motivation to access global carbon markets. Of course, right now, can I just switch to that slide?
Yes, I just put it up here.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to switch to that. Okay, maybe we'll just come back later. So yeah, but right now what I wanted to, we had a very interesting slide on how the carbon prices were falling, and it may not be the best time to do systemic GHG accounting because of accessing money from the carbon market. But nevertheless, that is one motivation that the cities have, and cities have leveraged CDM financing. One good example was a project in Fiji, which of course they did all of this validation before the carbon prices crashed. So we're really not sure right now in our research whether it has affected their implementation, because the actual costs that they sort of profited from were meant to be used for project implementation. But so that's a question. What happens with the variation? That's a question we had, and we couldn't answer it. That what happens when the variation in the carbon market and how it affects how it affects the methodologies that were validated in the first place, and how the cities leverage and what happened to that money, and whether the continuity was there or no. So yeah, this was the slide that we researched yesterday, and it's like a complete slowdown trend towards carbon. It doesn't seem very motivating to do a CDM project at this stage with the trend of the price of carbon shooting down. But still, there is a continued public awareness with the increased awareness on contributing towards emission reduction from every sector possible, and in every way. This still makes a lot of sense in terms of institutional organizational capacity, as well as business opportunities for cities. One interesting learning was that for the urban sector, especially when we are dealing with the multi-sectors, like the big urban sector bubble that Samir presented in the earlier slide, to break these, and we had that bubble for a specific reason. We could have had tight squares, or we could have tight silos. They're not that tight, and they're more like cross, engaging. But through these kind of initiatives, which create that platform for various sectors to start engaging, and each sector or each entity gets some incentive to do something towards a common objective. And we found that that seems to be working, and we've tried that with green city action planning, where again it's a platform. GHG emission inventories, we thought, is again a platform where entities are coming together towards a common objective. So aiming to sort of break those or create those integrated platforms, and so sorry, create those integrated platforms, this seemed like pretty interesting tool, and it brought various agencies together, and it brought many of us teammates together when we started actually working on the paper. So that's one interesting learning that we wanted to share. Oh, sorry.
That's okay. So we want to go through just the methodology to actually do this. So we're sort of presenting in very simple terms 3 steps. The first two deal with the project level greenhouse gas estimation, and the third deals with how do you translate those into a city inventory. So the first thing is that for the ADB safeguard statement, it talks about internationally recognized methodologies. So it's quite broad about what methodologies you can use. There was a study done last year that looked at the estimates that were done for the ADB's energy projects, and actually found that in a majority of a project there were, quote, significant deficiencies in the way that greenhouse gases were estimated. Also last year there was actually a set of guidelines that the ADB issued that discusses some standard methodologies and tools. So I think this is quite timely. And there are also efforts that Sonia talked about earlier to actually harmonize these amongst all of the IFIs. So there's a working group that's working towards this. I think they're starting with methodologies for energy projects, and they're going to slowly expand into other sectors. So we should have some more institution-wide guidance on this shortly. In general, there are sort of 2 key factors that you have to look at. The first is activity data, which is a measure of the level of activity during a specific time period. And the second is you multiply that by an emission factor, which is the mass of a greenhouse gas emission relative to a unit of activity. So, for example, for power projects, you can have an emission factor per megawatt hour, for transportation, per kilometer traveled, and so on.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing here this is actually a really tricky part, and most developing countries don't have standardized emission factors. Even in my past work on air quality management related issues, and again the urban sector is the most challenging, because the multiplicity of things happening in that space is too much. So everything rests. So say for example, the city or the country would tend to adopt an emission factor from the EU. It's not going to work, because it's just not going to work. The fuel mix is different, the acceleration is different, the engines are different, etc., etc. So this is a very, very tricky thing, and we are not sure. At least it was out of the scope of this paper. We kind of accepted what we got, but we are not sure whether countries and cities are actually, trying to develop customized or emission factors. But that affects the overall quantitative analysis a lot.
Another important thing is to identify the boundary of your analysis. So when you're looking at a project level estimate, what phases of your project life will be captured? Are you looking at what happens once the project is completed and operational, or are you also looking at during the construction phase, what's going to happen? And then also whether or not associated facilities will be included. So these are facilities that are not part of the project, but whose viability and existence depend on the project. And per the ADB safeguard statement, actually, you have to include these as well as part of your analysis. Now, in the context of a citywide greenhouse gas inventory, the boundary can be used to differentiate between different sources depending on where the emissions are physically originating. And we'll talk a bit more about this later in the presentation. Now, Sonia mentioned there are a number of tools that are available, and you have to sort of select one that works and is consistent with your methodology. Often you see a bit of a trade-off between how sophisticated a tool is and your data requirements. So a tool might be quite straightforward, require less data, but if you want to customize it more, you'll typically have to enter in more data. So there's that trade-off you have to be aware of. Also, there are some tools that work more or less like black boxes. So you put in some input and you got an output. Others that are more transparent that actually show you the process. So depending on how well you want to understand what's happening, that's a factor as well. And then as Sonia mentioned, one key factor is really there are some tools that are customized for certain sectors and for certain regions. So the emission factors are typically based on more local conditions rather than some sort of global averages.
Actually, we used all these criteria and we developed this. I mean, this articulated in our mind when we started quantifying the solid waste loan, because the waste characterization was not clear, the composition of waste was not clear. All the 4 cities collected it differently. All the 4 cities separated the waste differently. So we had to find a tool that would help us optimize that. And that was really the key thing, that which is the tool that's going to help us in this kind of baseline situation. So therefore, we couldn't use the black box because we didn't know really what we were inputting. So therefore, I just worked a little bit better for us in that situation.
And then Sonia said the sort of selection of the tool was an iterative process.
Yes.
So you see what tool might work, then you actually try it. If it doesn't work, you see what else is out there.
Yeah.
Okay, in terms of the collection of the data, so the first step is to collect what your base year is going to be. That's typically the most recent year for which you have a comprehensive set of data. You need to look at how you're going to be collecting the data, whether you'll be using a top-down approach where you're sort of leveraging existing data systems that are available institutionally, or are you doing a bottom-up approach where you're sort of collecting some data yourself or new data that's not previously available? Most often it's some sort of a hybrid approach where you leverage some data that's available and you also augment it with other data that you're actually collecting on the ground. Of course, if you have to establish data collection and standardization processes, so if you have different organizations you're dealing with, the data has to come to you in a way that you can manipulate it and analyze it. And of course, this is often the most time-consuming step of the whole process, is to actually collect the data from all the people who have it. Confirming or updating the emission factors. So we discussed this already, and there's a good example of this actually just coming up. And again, this iterative process which also informs your project design. So as you're doing your analysis, you're using different technology types and you're seeing what happens to your emissions. So it sort of goes hand in hand with your project design rather than something you do after your project design is complete.
Yeah.
That's when it adds the most value.
So besides for the project design, it's also the project preparation cycle, because if we really want to maximize this and utilize it for what it's meant to be, then there is already a PPT in process. We do have timelines and commitments. So how does one converge? And that was a very big challenge for us to sort of, even in the tool selection, and how we would converge and bring the team together to actually get some numbers which would mean something in the project at a glance sheet in terms of mitigation and adaptation for that project. So yeah, it is challenging, but the iteration works, and the information to project design, I think, is a very important factor, because at the PPTA stage, during at the time of feasibility, one can still make some adjustments. But if we miss that opportunity and we've already headed towards the detailed designs, then that adjustment becomes more and more difficult.
So on the emission factors, we just wanted to give an example. So there's an article in the New York Times last week which talks about how China's carbon dioxide emissions may have been overstated by more than 10%. And if you actually read into the details of why this happened, it's basically because the emission factors that they used were on average about 40% lower than the default values used by the IPCC. So this study actually looked at something like 600 different coal samples across China and compared them with the default values that had been used so far to do the emissions estimations for China. So just to say, this is actually quite an important point that can have very significant implications.
Very significant implications on what the country wants to project. So it's there are pros and cons of all of these things. And so on the technical, on the scientific side is basically, as engineers, we'd like to do something, but what is the projection and the perception is a bit of a, so we just wanted to share that learning.
So after you've done the first two steps, you've selected your tool and you've actually applied the tool and done your project level analysis, you have to now document this as part of a citywide greenhouse gas inventory. So in practice, this can be done by actually putting together many project level estimates. It can also be done by tools, designs for cities that sort of look more at a subsector level rather than at a project level. Until quite recently, actually, there were many different ways to document inventories. What's happened sort of last year is that there's an initiative called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol for Cities. It's a standard protocol developed by the World Resources Institute that has strong endorsement from the sort of international climate community that has now basically harmonized the way that cities can actually report their city level inventories. And it sort of covers different areas like stationary energy, transportation, waste, industrial process and product use, and agriculture, forestry, and land use, and also has guidance on how cities can actually put this together. So in terms of documentation, I think we're at a stage where there is some global consensus now on how we can actually document and report city-level inventories. So this is the case study that we've sort of been referring to throughout the presentation. It was a solid waste management project in the Philippines. We were covering 4 municipalities between 15,000 and 120,000 people. And the scope of the project included rehabilitation and development of landfills, installation of emission controls, material recovery, setting up improved waste collection systems, and also adopting waste to energy technologies. And as part of the PPTA project preparation, greenhouse gas emissions estimate was done. And this was partly motivated by trying to find a number to stick in the project of a glance sheet that we actually was credible and that we could defend and understand.
All you need is a platform to bring people together. That also was a platform that got us all engaged. And it was like, no, we're just not going to pull out a number, but we're going to give it some kind of, system.
So the first step was sort of the selection of the tool. So there were two tools that we looked at. So there was this IGES tool that was by the Institute of Global Environmental Strategies based in Japan, and then a tool by the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research based in Germany. They were both tools that were specifically for solid waste. Ultimately, we selected the IGES tool largely because it was customized for use in Southeast Asia, so it was much easier for us to use and to adapt. The cons for actually both the tools was that there was no provision for gas capture and waste to energy. So we actually had to do the waste to energy calculations offline in a separate spreadsheet before bringing them back in. And the outputs for the IGS were less compatible with some of the typical greenhouse gas reporting regimes. In our case, we were doing this at a project level. We weren't feeding this into a city level inventory. So this was less of a disadvantage in our case. So in terms of the actual analysis, the baseline year was 2014. So that's what the calculations were done based on. And there was not actually a lot of data that was available. So we had to do a waste analysis and characterization survey, and also a social survey to determine the volumes of the waste and the characteristics of the waste that were going into the 4 sites. The net emissions here were about 20 to 25,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. So about 1/4 of what the ADB deems significant. This is across all 4 of the sub-projects. And after the project, basically, when you install a landfill, because you're introducing anaerobic conditions, and you're producing methane, which is 25 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. Just introducing a landfill actually increases your greenhouse gas emissions. So, but we sort of offset that by introducing an enhanced recycling program and doing the waste to energy, and then also composting the organic waste, which we said replaces processed fertilizer. So we had some greenhouse gas savings there. So the net savings due to the project were somewhere between 5 and 10,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. Now, just to put this into perspective, the Fiji project that Sonia presented earlier was the savings were about 20,000 tons of carbon dioxide a year. And at that time, if you looked at the prices on the carbon market, based on the life of the project, which was 5 to 6 years, they were able to generate $1.35 million that they were able to use for their project implementation. These days, that sort of financial incentive is not as strong because the market is depressed. But just to give an idea that even at this level, the emissions can be quite significant. So now, where do we go from here and from these experiences?
So now minor details and the most simple things. So what now? So there's been so many learnings and like we've been sharing all along. But just to take off from, let's just talk about the project design, for example. How does this play out? The perception is we do a landfill and we're good. But that is not the good that happens. It's incomplete because you're actually increasing emissions if you don't capture them. So that was a very big learning. But the trade-off is in such small cities with such limited resource envelopes, how is methane capture even possible? And will there be enough? And who is going to do this? The public sector, government agency, they don't have the capacity. Private sector don't want to engage because it's such less... there's no money. So what are the solutions? And I mean, I'm not saying that we have the solutions, but that's something for us to think about as a team, because we are the ones engaging at that level, that we could catalyze this thinking. Can we combine infrastructure? Can we use such kind of methodologies and results to look at engaging cities with each other to do combined infrastructure and get private sector engagement where the profits are enough? That could be one solution where it's possible. So that's something for us to think about. And because most of our projects are ending with sanitary landfill closure. That's it. And we're really not doing waste to energy or methane capture. So that's been a very big learning. But nevertheless, trade-offs is something I think which is really critical to even optimizing our own development impacts. So, but what is a methodology to study trade-offs really? How do we look at it? We're trying to look at some interesting concepts on co-benefits through through the Green Cities thing, our program in Vietnam. And we've had some very nice engagement with the economics group. It's not a very established methodology, but it's a thought. And I think this is the space, and we are the teams that we should really escalate these thoughts and try to make a difference in bringing about some kind of change in thinking if we have to reach those larger goals. These are sometimes seemingly very small solutions and in a very small space. And for a mayor, for example, in a small secondary city in any country, he'd think like, this is a headache. But I think we are the ones who should be promoting that dialogue, because eventually countries and even MDBs are signing up to very large targets. Like, for example, the SDGs. If you go through the SDGs, there are many goals which will be achieved only if the smaller solutions are met first. And those smaller solutions are always at the citizen level, almost city level. So a way forward for us is to take this learning back and see how we can redesign some of our projects wherever there's appetite for it, so we could demonstrate at least some win somewhere. That's something, sure.
Just to add, and I think, where there are projects that we are doing sort of comprehensive urban planning and investment prioritization, this is sort of a very natural tool that can come in at that stage, because it sort of gives you unique insights. Because to be able to do a greenhouse gas inventory, you actually have to understand all of the processes that are happening in your city and how they come together. And even though the carbon market is sort of depressed right now, there's a lot of climate financing, and those pots are growing. So those are financing sources that cities could actually tap into, which would make it attractive for them to pursue this.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, just basically elaborating the same line of thought, I think we felt during our search that there was many entry points through urban operations, and like we heard today in the morning, I don't know, during the Insight Thursday, some very interesting opportunities for national level programs, because all of these environment and climate change issues are not localized. It's never one city's or one agency's responsibility. It's always a larger collective responsibility that would actually enable an impact to occur. And these are just some examples where we felt that there were sufficient entry points in our own engagement. Um, we have lots of questions still remaining, which we've been raising all through, and that's why this is really a work in progress. It's a work in thought, and we're hoping that this working paper can lead to other engagements and inform other engagements from our learnings. And we'd be really happy to hear from other regions and see if there are better experiences that we could bring back to Southeast Asia. I know, I was the presentation today morning was really insightful. And there are enabling regulations, but sometimes what happens is those enabling regulations are not operationalized. We found that through our secondary cities, green cities work in Vietnam, where we're trying to help them operationalize their own green growth strategy, for example. So the similar kind of issues can be taken up from here. And how do we converge on the project processing resource envelopes, and how do we converge financing from various funds or various pots, even within ADB? That's also a task. So with those few questions and discussion points, we welcome more learning and more experience sharing.